All right, so have you ever heard of a king, I mean a real king, who thought he was like chosen by God to rule, but then gets totally outsmarted and betrayed?
Oh, absolutely. It happens more often than you'd think.
Yeah, well, we're talking about King Richard II, and his story is like something right out of Shakespeare, which actually it is because Shakespeare wrote a play about him.
Right.
And you've shared all these really fascinating sources with us, historical accounts, Shakespeare's take on him, the whole nine yards. So let's unpack it all. What do you say?
Sounds good to me.
Perfect.
Okay.
So Richard II, what is it about his story that you find so captivating?
Well, I think it really shows just how fragile power can be, even when you're a king. Especially when you're a king who truly believes he's God's chosen representative on earth.
Hmm.
I mean, that kind of belief can really shape your whole worldview.
Oh, absolutely. And that's exactly what we're going to get into today. How this king, who started out with such high hopes and expectations, could fall so far from grace.
Right.
It's a story that still has echoes today, don't you think?
Totally. Think about all those leaders, even now, who just, I don't know, they think they're untouchable, surrounded by people who just tell them what they want to hear. They don't see the cracks forming. It can happen to anyone.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that no matter how powerful someone seems, there are always limits.
Definitely.
Okay, so Richard II. Let's set the scene. We're in the late 14th century. England is in the middle of the Hundred Years' War, and things are not going well.
Not at all.
And then, boom, young Richard II comes onto the scene. He's only 10 years old when he becomes king. Do you imagine that? A 10-year-old with the weight of an entire kingdom on his shoulders.
It's hard to fathom, isn't it? And you have to remember, back then, kingship was practically a religious concept. He wasn't just a ruler. He was considered God's anointed. His authority came directly from God.
That's a lot of pressure for a kid.
Right.
But he wasn't just some, like, super serious kid just going through the
Oh,
motions.
no, not at all.
He was actually described as being quite a character. He loved spectacle, big parties, fancy clothes, the whole royal treatment.
Oh, yes. Very flamboyant.
He even popularized the use of the fork, which is kind of a funny detail.
It is.
But behind all that outward show, he was, well, some people said he was insecure, prone to playing favorites.
That's a pretty common thread throughout history.
Yeah, it makes him all the more interesting as a historical figure, don't you think? This mix of confidence and vulnerability.
Absolutely. And those favorites, the ones he surrounded himself with, that actually became a major issue during his reign.
Because?
Well, because Richard had a tendency to elevate commoners to powerful positions. Men like Michael de la Pole and Robert de Vere. And, well, the old guard, the established nobility, they weren't too happy about that. It felt like an attack on their status.
They felt like he was messing with their system. And all of this is happening against the backdrop of the Hundred Years' War, which is draining the country's resources and making people really anxious.
Right, and the war's not going well for England either.
So the situation is already tense, like a powder keg waiting to explode.
And then in 1381 it does. The Peasants' Revolt erupts.
The what?
The Peasants' Revolt. It's a huge uprising, and it throws London into chaos.
Wow.
People are demanding reforms, social and economic justice, and Richard, who is still just a teenager at this point, is suddenly confronted with just how fragile his authority really is. He watches his capital city burn, faces down an angry mob who are literally challenging his right to rule.
Wow. That must have been a turning point for him.
Oh, definitely. It's hard to imagine what that experience must have been like. Terrifying, for sure.
Yeah, I can imagine.
But it seems like it also might have reinforced his belief in his own charisma, his ability to connect with the common people.
That's interesting. It's like the revolt shakes him to his core, but also feeds this idea he has about himself as this, I don't know, almost like a divinely chosen figure.
It's this weird paradox. And of course, not everyone was buying into that idea, especially not his uncles.
His uncles.
John of Gaunt and Thomas of Woodstock, the Duke of Gloucester, they thought they should have more power, more say in how the kingdom was run.
Why? Because they were older.
Yes, and they saw Richard as too young, too easily influenced by his favorite.
And that's where the trouble really begins.
Exactly. That's when those simmering tensions within the ruling class, they start to boil over. And that leads to the emergence of the Lords Appellant.
Who?
The Lords Appellant, they were a group of powerful nobles who basically decided they'd had enough of Richard's shenanigans. They directly challenged his authority. And that ultimately led to the infamous Merciless Parliament of 1388.
The Merciless Parliament. The name alone sounds intimidating.
Yes, it was
Yeah.
a pretty brutal affair.
How's it happen?
Richard's favorites, they were impeached and executed, and Richard himself was humiliated. He was forced to watch as his closest advisors were stripped of their power and punished.
Wow. So much for divine right.
It was a harsh reminder that even a king who believes he answers only to God isn't actually above the law, not when a powerful group of nobles decides to take matters into their own hands.
That must have been a huge blow to Richard.
Oh, it was a major turning point in his reign. It's like he'd been flying high, but now suddenly his wings were clipped. He was shown that his power wasn't absolute.
But I have a feeling he wasn't just going to take that lying down.
Oh, you're right about that. Richard was a survivor. He bided his time, waited for the right opportunity, and then he made his move.
So he was playing the long game. This is getting good.
It is.
So tell me, what did he do to get back in the game, to consolidate his power and, maybe get a little revenge on those who'd humiliated him?
Well, that's a story for another time.
Oh, come on. Don't leave us hanging.
We've got to save something for the next part of our deep dive, but let me just say this. Richard's comeback is a lesson in strategic patience, political maneuvering, and let's just say a touch of ruthlessness.
Ooh, I can't wait to hear about that. This is already so fascinating. So if you're enjoying this conversation as much as we are, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next part of our deep dive into the reign of Richard II. We'll uncover his calculated comeback and the dramatic events that eventually lead to his downfall. You won't want to miss it. Okay, so Richard's been, well, kind of put in his place by these Lords Appellant. He's lost his favorites, his authority's been challenged, publicly humiliated even. You'd think maybe he'd be a little, subdued after all that.
You'd think.
But that doesn't seem to be the case, does it?
Not really, no. Richard is, it seems he's not one to just accept defeat.
He's a fighter.
Definitely. He spends the next few years very carefully rebuilding his power base, consolidating his control, especially over the royal finances, and waiting, really just waiting for the right moment to strike back at those who, those who wronged him.
It's a period of what, like calculated, simmering resentment?
You could say that, yes.
So he's playing the long game. But I'm guessing those Lords Appellant, they weren't just sitting around, sipping tea and whatnot.
Oh, absolutely not. The political scene was still incredibly volatile at this point.
Right.
And the Lords Appellant, they were powerful, yes, but they weren't exactly a united front,
Yeah, that makes sense.
They had their own ambitions, their own rivalries, and Richard, he was pretty clever about it. He exploited those divisions, turned them against each other, slowly chipped away at their influence.
So he's using their own strengths against them.
Precisely. Divide and conquer. It's a classic strategy for a reason.
Yeah, smart. So what else does he do to reassert his authority?
Well, aside from that, he really focused on strengthening the monarchy's financial position.
Okay.
The 100 Years' War, it was still going on, remember?
Oh, right, of course.
And it was a massive drain on England's resources. So Richard streamlines tax collection, reclaims lands that had been granted away. He basically just tries to make the crown less reliant on Parliament for funding. Oh, I see. To give him more leverage.
Exactly. More independence.
Makes sense. If you control the money, you control the power.
Right. And Richard also undertakes this really symbolic journey to Ireland in 1394.
To Ireland? What for?
It was partly about asserting English authority over the Irish lords. They'd been getting a bit rebellious. But it was also a way for Richard to, I don't know, it's like a PR move almost, to project this image of strength, of true kingship.
It's all about perception.
Absolutely.
Uh-huh.
Showing those nobles back home that he was still a force to be reckoned with.
But I have a feeling Richard wasn't content with just, getting back what he'd lost. He wanted more than that, didn't he?
Well, revenge does seem to be a motivating factor for him.
So what happens?
In 1397, he makes his move. He accuses 3 of the leading lords appellant to the Duke of Gloucester, the Earl of Arundel, the Earl of Warwick, of treason.
Ooh, treason. That's a pretty serious charge.
Very serious.
What happens to them? Well, Arundel, he's executed. Gloucester dies mysteriously in prison, most likely murdered on Richard's orders, if we're being honest. And Warwick is banished to the Isle of Man.
Wow.
It was a really brutal show of force.
No kidding. He's sending a message.
Oh, absolutely. A very clear message.
Don't mess with me.
Exactly.
So at this point, Richard has gone from, being the puppet of those Lords Appellant to, well, kind of the puppet master himself, hasn't he?
You could say that, yes. He also starts taking steps to, I don't know, to solidify his image as this, like, divinely appointed king.
Okay.
He commissions these really elaborate portraits of himself, these big ceremonies, things like that. He even tries to, like, start a cult of personality around himself, you know?
Whoa.
He wants to be seen as more than just a king. He wants to be seen as this, like, sacred figure chosen by God.
It's almost like he's overcompensating for something, isn't it?
Perhaps. But all this, it ends up alienating Parliament, the nobility, too.
Right, because it seems kind of shady.
They see his growing authoritarianism, the lavish spending, his disregard for, the traditional checks on royal power, and it worries them.
So he's winning the battle, but maybe losing the war.
Exactly. He might be consolidating his power in the short term, but he's making some very powerful enemies in the process.
Right, and that's where Henry Bolingbroke comes in.
Ah, yes.
The cousin who was humiliated, right, when
Yeah.
Richard took his inheritance.
That's the one.
That couldn't have gone over well.
Not at all.
So is this where things start to go downhill for Richard?
You could say that. In 1398, Bolingbroke, he gets into this dispute with another nobleman, Thomas Mowbray, Duke of Norfolk. They accuse each other of treason.
Oh, wow. More treason.
And Richard, he agrees to settle the whole thing through, get this, a trial by combat.
A trial by combat? Like with swords and stuff?
Yes, exactly. Imagine it, these two knights in full armor.
It's like something out of a movie.
I know. And the whole court's assembled, everyone's watching. The tension must have been incredible.
I bet Richard was loving it. All that drama. But this is Richard we're talking about, so of course, things don't exactly go as planned, do they?
You know, Richard. Always has to be a twist. So at the very last minute, just as the two knights are about to charge, Richard intervenes. Stops the whole thing.
What? Why?
He decides to banish both of them, Bolingbroke and Mowbray.
Banish them. That seems a little extreme, doesn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
what was the point of even having the whole trial by combat thing if he was just going to banish them anyway?
Well, probably he thought he was being clever,
Right.
Getting rid of two potential rivals in one fell swoop.
Huh.
But it turns out to be a pretty big calculation.
How so?
Well, Bolingbroke's banishment is only supposed to be for 10 years. But then John of Gaunt dies in 1399.
Okay.
And Richard, impulsive as always, he seizes Bolingbroke's inheritance.
No way.
The Duchy of Lancaster, it was huge, extremely wealthy.
So Richard basically just went and made an enemy of, well, basically everyone who might have supported Bolingbroke, right?
Pretty much. He turned Bolingbroke into a martyr, a symbol for all those who already resented Richard's, his whole way of ruling.
So he pushed him too far, made him an enemy of the state. And Bolingbroke, I'm guessing he wasn't just going to sit back and take it, was he?
Nope, not at all.
So what happens next? Spill the tea.
All right. But we'll have to save the really juicy details for the next part of our deep dive.
Oh, come on. You can't just leave us hanging like that again.
I know, but trust me, you're going to want to hear this. Richard's actions have set off a chain of events that will, they completely change the course of English history.
Okay, I'm intrigued. I guess we'll have to wait for the next part then. All right, so last we left off, Richard he'd made a few enemies along the way.
A few?
He had alienated Parliament, angered a lot of the nobility, and then, he kind of pushed his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, way too far.
Yeah, that was not a smart move.
So where do we go from there? What happens next?
Okay, so Richard makes yet another, I guess you could say, miscalculation.
Oh, no. What did he do this time?
He decides to leave England.
Why?
There's a rebellion brewing in Ireland. He decides to go deal with it personally.
And that leaves England, just wide open?
Pretty much. And Bolingbroke, well, he sees his chance.
Of course he does.
So, in July 1399, Bolingbroke takes action. He returns to England with a small army, lands at Ravenspur in Yorkshire, but he's very careful about how he presents it all. He claims he's only there to reclaim his inheritance, the Duchy of Lancaster.
Right, playing the victim card.
Exactly. And his timing, it couldn't have been better. Richard's out of the country. A lot of the nobles are already unhappy with Richard's rule.
So they're ready for a change.
Exactly. And Bolingbroke, he gathers support so quickly. His forces just grow and grow as he marches south.
So Richard's power base is basically falling apart while he's off fighting this rebellion. What does he do when he gets word of all this?
Well, he tries to come back, of course, rushes back to England, but it's too little, too late.
Bolingbroke's already taken over.
Pretty much. Richard finds himself completely isolated, abandoned by most of his allies.
It's crazy how quickly things can turn around, isn't it?
It really is. One minute you're the king, the next minute, well, you're practically a prisoner. Richard realizes pretty quickly that his situation is hopeless.
So what does he do?
He surrenders to Bolingbroke at Flint Castle in Wales.
Can you imagine that scene?
It must have been intense.
Two cousins, one's close, and now, like, on opposite sides of this power struggle that's going to decide the fate of England.
It's a powerful image. Richard, the anointed king, forced to submit to his own cousin, the cousin he had wronged and underestimated.
So what happens to Richard after he surrenders? Does Bolingbroke, I mean, what does he do with him? Just lock him up, or is there something more dramatic in store?
Well, Bolingbroke, he's got a problem.
What do you mean?
Well, he can't just seize the throne by force, you know? He's got to make it look legitimate.
Right, there's got to be some kind of legal process.
Exactly. So he does this very, carefully orchestrated thing. He gets Parliament on his side. They force Richard to abdicate.
To give up the throne.
Right. And then in this big ceremony, Henry presents himself as the rightful heir.
He's basically just rewriting history to fit his narrative.
That's one way to put it. And, get this, he uses Richard's own deposition as evidence that a king can be removed from power if he's not ruling justly.
Wow.
Yeah, it sets a pretty dangerous precedent, one that's going to have consequences for a long time to come.
So Richard's dethroned.
Yeah.
But does he at least get to live out his days in peace somewhere?
Unfortunately, no. Richard, he's just too much of a threat to Henry's power, even locked up. So Richard is imprisoned in Pontefract Castle, and he dies there in February 1400.
He died in prison. What happened?
It's a bit of a mystery, actually. The official story is that he starved himself to death out of grief.
Grief.
Yeah, but a lot of people believe that he was, murdered on Henry's orders.
Another royal mystery.
Right. Either way, Richard's death, it removes a major obstacle for Henry. He can finally consolidate his power without worrying about Richard coming back to challenge him.
So it's a tragic end for Richard. But his story, it doesn't end there, does it? I mean, what kind of impact does all this have? What happens to England?
Well, the fact that Richard was removed from power like that, it created this, the stain on the legitimacy of the whole Lancastrian dynasty.
Henry's dynasty.
Right. So even though Henry tried really hard to make his claim to the throne look legit, there were always whispers about how he'd basically usurped the throne.
It's like once that seed of doubt is planted, it's hard to get rid of.
Exactly. And, Richard's deposition, it sets a precedent for challenging the divine right of kings. It weakens the monarchy and, I'd say, contributes to this instability that eventually leads to the Wars of the Roses.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so Richard's story, it's not just some personal tragedy. It's a major turning point in English history.
It's like a ripple effect.
Exactly. It shows how even seemingly small events can have huge, really huge consequences down the line.
That's incredible. So Richard's reign, it's full of drama, intrigue, political maneuvering. It's still fascinating all these centuries later.
It really is.
And it's more than just a story about kings and queens and battles and all that. It's about human nature, ambition, betrayal, the things that make us who we are.
Well said.
Well, this has been an incredible deep dive, wouldn't you say?
I've learned a lot.
We started with Richard's extravagant court,
Mm-hmm.
went through the 100 Years' War, the Peasants' Revolt, all the drama with the Lord's Appellant. It's just amazing to see how his personality, the choices he made, the historical context, it all just comes together to create this really, really dramatic and ultimately tragic chapter in English history.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you for guiding us through it all. I really appreciate it.
It's been my pleasure.
Really.
Well said.
And all our listeners out there, thank you for, for sharing these sources with us. We hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into the reign of Richard II. It's a story that, well, it just keeps on giving.
Definitely.
And that's a wrap on this episode of The Deep Dive. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on our next exploration of, whatever fascinating historical rabbit hole we decide to jump down next.
Always an adventure.
Until then, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.